Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I want to talk about Andrew Jackson, specifically the Jacksonian democracy. I've done videos in which I've talked more about the Republican Party, the rise of the Republican Party, and the factions within the Republican Party itself. Now, the main rival of the Republican Party during the Construction era were the Democrats. And the Democrats can trace their provenance to Andrew Jackson, right? And the Jacksonian democracy. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, about his birth and things like that. But I want to focus on Jacksonian democracy and what they stood for. In order to be able to understand Jacksonian democracy more, let's try and understand the founding fathers, right? So Jacksonian democracy advocated for the common man. When we talk about the common man under Jacksonian philosophy, he was actually really referring to the white man. So he expanded franchise to the white man, right? Men who didn't have property. At the beginning of our democracy, our founding fathers were really aristocrats, right? And you can see from the constitution of the cabinet, the first cabinet, right? George Washington himself, our president, was one of the richest men in America, in the American colonies. In fact, historians peg George Washington as being the richest president we've ever had. That's prior to Donald Trump, but relative to the population, George Washington was still by far the richest president we've ever had. Uh, Thomas Jefferson, if there was an aristocratic family, Thomas Jefferson came from an aristocratic family. His mother was a Randolph. You see that the Randolphs were a very, aristocratic family in Virginia. In fact, I think our first Attorney General was a Randolph. Uh, Thomas Jefferson had many, you know, cousins, relatives who were within our government who were, aristocrats themselves. John Marshall, for instance, was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. John Marshall was one of our early Chief Justices and possibly our longest. He was Chief Justice for over 30 years. And John Marshall is of the famous Madison versus uh, Marbury case. And he was one who made the decision regarding judicial review. It's a very famous uh, constitutional law case, and everybody learns about it in law school. So John Marshall and Chief Justice John Marshall and uh, Thomas Jefferson were cousins, although they hated each other. So our founding fathers were aristocrats, possibly you can say with the exception of John Adams. But John Adams, even though he didn't have wealth, he was a descendant of Puritans. But something people forget about the elites and aristocrats is they welcome and embrace geniuses. John Adams was no doubt a genius. He came from a very, even though his father was a farmer, but was a gifted man. He was our first president who went to Harvard. He was a lawyer. And his wife, Abigail Adams, she was his cousin, by the way. Abigail Adams was a woman of superior intellect, right? She was a genius herself, possibly. And of course, both of them, their progeny, uh, John Quincy Adams, is still rated as our president who had by far the highest IQ. He had an IQ of 175 through history and metrics. They were able to estimate his IQ, right? At 175, that's by far the highest IQ of any president we've had. In fact, that's a very, very, very genius IQ. It's higher than the IQ of Albert Einstein, just to let you know. So there's something called geniocracy, right? And that's a government of where the leaders are actually geniuses. Of they have, they're highly intelligent. So that's what John Adams was, and that's what Alexander Hamilton was as well. Of course, everybody knows Alexander Hamilton was born poor. He was born out of wedlock. He was an immigrant, but he ended by virtue of his intellect. He ended up marrying one of the richest families uh, in New York. right? And so something aristocrats or wealthy families do is they embrace geniuses because they will give them genius offspring and they'll be able to help them expand their wealth and things like that. So they embrace geniuses. It doesn't matter that they don't have money. They embrace them, just like Alexander Hamilton was embraced by one of the wealthiest families in New York. So we had a government of elites, and by the time of Andrew Jackson, he was against elites, right? And so that's what Jacksonian democracy sort of was about. It was anti-aristocracy. It was it was anti-elite, and again, at the beginning of our democracy, you find that the vote was limited to white men who had property, right? Not everybody could vote. So that preamble, all men were created equal. Did our founding fathers really believe that? From, again, their constitution, from the way that the cabinet was constituted, I'd say not, because they were the elites, they were the aristocrats of the colonies, right? James Madison came from a wealthy family of landowners, and they owned many slaves. We've already talked about Thomas Jefferson, and et cetera, et cetera. So Andrew Jackson, was an orphan at a very early age. He was born poor, but Andrew Jackson was a very intelligent man, and this is something that populist movements normally don't realize. Their leaders might be a genius. Some people, I don't know. Andrew Jackson, through these historymetrics as well, is pegged as having a very high IQ as well, about 145. It's very sick. That's genius IQ. He was an intelligent man, right? So he became a self-educated lawyer. He became a justice. He became a successful general, right? I don't like the things he did, but he became a very successful major general in the U.S. Army, right? And so Andrew Jackson's Jacksonian movement supported the expansion of the franchise to white men who didn't own property. So that made a huge difference, right? So white men who did not own property could vote, and he was saying all white men are equal. That was part of the foundation of the Jacksonian philosophy, that all white men are, equal, right? And so, and there were other things that they believed in as well. Initially, the Jacksonian movement was claiming that they wanted less federal government and they wanted power to devolve to the states. This was what their philosophy was saying. They advocated laissez-faire. That's less government in the economy as well. And but in practice, we see that Andrew Jackson did something different, because there was a time of tariffs, the tariffs of abominations, when tariffs were raised by the Federalists and their progeny. And the Democrats were against that. People from the South were against the raising of tariffs. Now, if they raised tariffs, it protected northern manufacturing, but the South didn't like the raising of tariffs. And so Andrew Jackson's followers, especially in South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, and he was the vice president of Andrew Jackson, right? They formed a party called the Nullifiers, and they were saying that if the federal government made an unconstitutional law and the states believed it was unconstitutional, that the states had the power to nullify, invalidate that law. Now, Andrew Jackson, so these were people who were advocating states' rights. So that's states' rights to the extreme. And they were also trying to indicate that, that states have the right to secede. Now, Andrew Jackson now showed his true philosophy, right? Andrew Jackson was a strong-willed man, and he was president at this time. He threatened to hang the nullifiers. Anybody who says that the states have the power to invalidate a law by the federal government, Andrew Jackson said he's going to hang them, right? And he threatened to hang them, and he threatened to use military force, right, in the states. So he didn't really believe, in practice, he didn't really believe in this states' rights he was talking about. So Andrew Jackson actually centralized power more, to the extent they started calling him King Andrew I, right? So this was a man whose followers believed that, okay, he believed in states' rights, and that a, 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 a limited federal government, right? But in practice, that wasn't what Andrew Jackson did, right? So he was against the nullifiers, and he threatened to hang them. So he actually centralized power more. Now, something else that the Jacksonian democracy espoused was uh, the notion of, in terms of currency, they advocated free money, right? An expansionary monetary supply of money. So remember, I've talked about the gold standard, right? So the opponents of the Democrats had advocated for a gold standard. That's where they were. The currency, the money supply was fixed to, uh, was tied to a fixed amount of gold held in reserve. And this was something that bankers in the North, bankers in England supported. However, the farmers, the agrarian economy of the South, they didn't want this because they had loans, and so they wanted, uh, more money in supply. So they were advocating something called bimetallism. Bimetallism meant that instead of the gold standard, that the federal government should also have unlimited silver coinage, which would allow them to increase the money supply. And so uh, this was something Andrew Jackson actually supported. So he allowed an expanded money supply, so that it also led to more land speculation in the West. And so this caused, it caused a depression in the economy later on. The other thing that Jacksonian philosophy did was, Andrew Jackson got into this war with the banks. We had a national bank. It was called the Second National Bank. This was part of what was called the American system, as first espoused by Alexander Hamilton. The idea of a national bank was that the national bank would hold federal government funds, and it would also have control of the economy. But Andrew Jackson and his followers believed that this was just pandering to the elites of New York, and it meant that the elites uh, controlled the economy, and it was at the disadvantage of the commoners. When we say common man, he's really talking about white men. And so Andrew Jackson sort of did not renew the charter of the Second National Bank. And so what he did was he created pet banks, and he took away federal deposits and gave them to the states. And he created, he it led to the power of these pet banks. So eventually, because of the unlimited money supply, which fueled land speculation in the West, Andrew Jackson was also involved in the Indian Removal Act, where they started to dispossess Native Americans of their lands in the West so that white settlers could move in. So this led to what's called the Panic of 1937. Sorry, 1837, the Panic of 1837. So it was an economic depression. And so economy was bad, and people lost their jobs. There was a lot of unemployment, and this was because of the excessive speculation that was going on, and the excessive money currency in circulation because of the destruction of the Second National Bank. So, but by this time, 1837, Andrew Jackson was out of office, and it was his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who bore the brunt of the fallout from the economic bubble created by Andrew Jackson's policies. So that was another feature of Jacksonian democracy. They expanded the vote to white men, instead of white men with property. So all white men were equal. This was something they advocated. They were advocating restricted federal government, even though that wasn't what Andrew Jackson did in practice. Andrew Jackson, again, he threatened to hang the nullifiers who were advocating states' rights. And of course, he destroyed the Second National Bank and created his pet banks, which subsequently led to um, uh, an economic depression and the Panic of 1837. Now, something else that the Jacksonian democracy did was he created the spoils system. I mentioned this in an earlier video that Republicans, after they won the Civil War, defeating the secessionists, right? They now took over the spoil system. But the spoil system wasn't created by the Republicans. Of course, the spoil system was abused by Republicans, including Roscoe Conkling and his followers. And of course, it ultimately led to the unfortunate assassination of an American president, James Garfield, by a lunatic a lunatic Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau was someone who expected to benefit from the spoil system. And with the assassination of James Garfield, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Chester A. Arthur, the vice president of James Garfield, he decided to reform the civil service and make it merit-based instead of a patronage system. So Andrew Jackson is the one who actually created the spoil system. He felt that it was a way for him to reward those who supported him politically, and of course something else. He felt that the populist movement he was leading was actually more reflective of power to the people's power. Something else that Jacksonian democracy advocated was popular sovereignty, and he believed that he was trying to say that look, power really belonged to the populace, to the masses, and not to aristocrats and the elites. So he was really against the elitism that the country was really built on. It was elites that actually built the country. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a founding father. Benjamin Franklin was a self-made man. He didn't come from money, but he was a genius, right? They called him Dr. Benjamin Franklin, right? So these are founding fathers. If they didn't have property and money, they had superior intellect. Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams. So it was a country created by the wealthy and the geniuses of the Northeast, right? That included Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin. He was originally from Massachusetts. He moved to Pennsylvania. John Adams from Massachusetts, and then the wealthy people in the South that included George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, amongst others, and the Randolphs. So, our founding fathers were really aristocrats, right? If they weren't wealthy, they were geniuses. So there's something called geniocracy. That's a government of geniuses, right? Government where the leaders are geniuses. So that's what we had. We had either an aristocracy or a geniocracy. And Andrew Jackson's Jacksonian democracy was a backlash against this, and he was saying no, that let the government be in the power of the common white man, and not the propertied white man or the genius white man. So that's what the Jacksonian democracy was about. Now, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I've been doing videos. I want to keep this short. I'm going to talk later on, do some other videos. But in any event, my spiel is that I've been wrongfully detained. I was framed in Montgomery County, Maryland, and pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. I'll keep you posted.